Hello, my friend. I'm glad you're here tonight, whatever the day was, and I know some days are a great deal. I really do. You made it to the end of it, and now you've found your way here, and that means you've given yourself permission to rest. I want to help with that. That's what this is for. So settle in. You're in exactly the right place. Before we go anywhere, can I ask something small? If this channel has ever helped you sleep, if you've ever found yourself here on a difficult night and felt something loosen in your chest, would you consider hitting subscribe and maybe leaving a like on this one? It costs you nothing, and it genuinely matters more than you might think. It's how this little channel finds someone else who needs it. Someone who's lying awake somewhere at 2 in the morning, not quite sure why, and who might just need a quiet voice and a good story. That's what it does. So thank you, truly, for every one of those small things. Now, where are you listening from tonight? I find myself thinking about this honestly. Maybe you're in a bedroom somewhere in London, and it's the particular kind of late October evening where the rain hasn't quite started but you can feel it coming, that pressure in the air, the windows going dark early. Or perhaps you're in an apartment in Chicago, the city doing its thing 14 floors below you. All those lights, all that motion, and you up here in the quiet with your phone on the pillow. Or maybe, and I love thinking about this one, maybe you're somewhere in New Zealand, in a house that's finally gone still, finally yours, that specific exhale of a house after everyone else has gone to sleep. Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're there. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I read every single one. I mean that. Now, let me ask you to do something for me. I want you to find your shoulders and drop them. Not dramatically, just let them fall to wherever they actually want to be, which is probably a good 2 inches lower than where you were keeping them. And your jaw, let it go soft. Let there be a little space between your back teeth. And your legs, wherever they are, let them get heavy. Let the surface beneath you hold them. You don't have to carry anything right now. The night is doing the holding. Comfortable? Good. I want to tell you about a woman that history has described so many times, in so many languages, across so many centuries, that the descriptions have almost entirely buried the person. You know her name. Of course you do. But I want to start in a specific, quiet place. Not with the famous story, not with the asp or the barge or the gold, but with a coin. There is a silver coin, minted around 32 BCE, that bears the profile of Cleopatra VII, not the Cleopatra of Hollywood, not the Cleopatra of Shakespeare, not the heavy-lidded seductress that 2,000 years of Roman-descended culture trained us to expect. The woman on this coin has a strong, prominent nose, a firm jaw, a gaze that, even in silver, even in miniature, feels entirely without anxiety. She looks like exactly what she was, a head of state. She looks like someone who had made decisions and would make more. The Romans looked at this woman and spent the better part of a century telling the world she was a temptress, a sorceress, a dangerous foreign body that had tried to corrupt 2 of Rome's greatest men and nearly brought the whole republic to its knees through nothing more substantial than desire. What they did not tell the world, what they worked, I think, with genuine deliberateness to suppress, was the actual nature of the threat she posed, which was not seduction, which was not beauty, which was something considerably more serious than either. Tonight, I want to give you back the version they spent centuries trying to erase. Let's go. The body they found in the mausoleum was dressed in full royal regalia. This is one of the few things about Cleopatra's death that the ancient sources broadly agree on. She was found, by Octavian's men, who had broken through the door when the guards outside raised the alarm, lying on a golden couch, dressed as a pharaoh, adorned in the manner of a god. Her 2 attendants, Iras and Charmion, were dying beside her. Charmion, according to the Greek biographer Plutarch, was still upright, barely, adjusting the diadem on her mistress's head when the Roman soldiers entered. One of them, furious, demanded to know if this was well done. Charmion is reported to have answered that it was very well done and worthy of the descendant of so many kings. Then she fell. It is August, in Alexandria, in the year 30 BCE. The air in the mausoleum is close and warm, the particular heat of an Egyptian summer that does not move, that settles into stone and linen and stays there, heavy with the smell of cedar oil used on the wood of the furniture, with kaifi, the ceremonial incense the Egyptians burned in the presence of the divine. The walls are thick, but not thick enough to keep out the late summer Mediterranean afternoon, that quality of light that turns everything gold without meaning to, that falls across marble floors as though the sun itself is performing something. The queen is dead. She was 39 years old. Hello, my friend. Come in. Settle down wherever you are tonight. I hope it's somewhere comfortable, somewhere where you can let your shoulders drop and your jaw go soft. If you're in bed, let the weight of the blankets do their work. If you're on a sofa somewhere, let it hold you. If you've got the kitchen to yourself tonight, the house quiet around you. I know that particular kind of quiet, and it's a good one. Before we go anywhere, a gentle request. If this channel has ever helped you rest, if you've ever woken up with your phone still playing and realized you fell asleep somewhere in ancient Rome or Renaissance Florence, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. And if tonight's story moves you, a like genuinely helps more than you might think. It's the thing that tells the algorithm this matters. And I think this one matters. I want to know where you're listening from tonight. A bedroom in Cincinnati with the ceiling fan running. A flat in Dublin with the rain doing what Dublin rain does. A quiet house somewhere in rural Japan with the windows open to the dark. Leave it in the comments. I read them. I genuinely do. Now, dim the lights if you can. Let the phone rest on the pillow beside you. Let your legs go heavy. Let your jaw unclench. Take one breath that's a little slower than the last one. Comfortable? Good. Let me take you somewhere. Here is the thing I want to start with tonight. The thing that I find genuinely difficult to shake. When Octavian, the man who would become the first Roman emperor, who would rename himself Augustus, whose face ended up on more statues than almost any human being in the ancient world, when Octavian finally entered Alexandria and found that Cleopatra had died before he could take her prisoner, he was furious. Not grief-stricken, not awed, furious, because she had taken from him the one thing he had planned for, the one thing that would have made his victory complete in the eyes of Rome. He had intended to parade her. Let me tell you about the Roman triumph, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising, and because without understanding it, you cannot fully understand what Cleopatra's death meant as a political act. The Roman triumph, the Triumphus, was one of the most spectacular rituals in the ancient world. It was awarded by the Senate to a general who had won a major military victory, and it was, at its core, a piece of theatre. The general rode through the streets of Rome in a chariot, painted red, dressed in the robes of Jupiter himself, purple and gold, with a slave behind him holding a laurel wreath over his head and whispering, by tradition, Memento Mori. Remember that you will die. The crowds lined the streets. The temples were open. The smell of sacrifice, roasting meat, incense, burning laurel, hung over the whole city. And at the center of the procession, displayed for the Roman public to see, were the conquered. Not just plunder, people, the defeated kings, queens, generals, the figures who had dared to challenge Rome, were led through the streets in chains, or carried on litters, displayed like objects in a cabinet. Children of foreign royalty walked in triumphs. Vercingetorix, the great Gaulish chieftain who had come closer than almost anyone to defeating Julius Caesar, walked in Caesar's triumph in 46 BCE and was then, when the procession was over, taken to a cell and strangled. That was the fate the triumph made visible. You existed now as Rome's property. Your identity, who you had been, what you had stood for, belonged to Rome to define. Octavian had planned exactly this for Cleopatra. We know it from the sources. He wanted her in his triumph. He wanted Rome to see her, the queen who had held Egypt, who had allied herself with Antony against him, who had very nearly helped create an Eastern empire that would have permanently redrawn the map of power in the ancient world. He wanted her body in the street, her sovereignty on display as a thing that had been taken from her. The historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century CE, suggests that Octavian even tried to keep Cleopatra alive long enough to be exhibited, sending a man named Proculeius to prevent her from harming herself. There are accounts that Octavian visited her in the mausoleum, that he tried to reassure her of his intentions. She was not reassured. The scholar Adrian Goldsworthy, in his careful biography of the period, notes that whatever Octavian promised, Cleopatra clearly did not believe him. She was right not to. Back in the mausoleum, in that close August heat, with the cedar oil and the ceremony and the weight of the diadem on her head, she had made a calculation, a final one. And the calculation was this: she would not give him the image. So he invented one. This is the part I find most quietly extraordinary about everything that followed. Because Octavian still had his triumph. He still paraded Cleopatra through the streets of Rome. He simply used an effigy, a representation of her body, carried on a litter, with, according to the sources, a snake on its arm, the serpent, the asp, the image that would outlast everything else. We cannot know with certainty how Cleopatra died. The ancient sources are not in full agreement, and the biographer Stacy Schiff, whose 2010 biography of Cleopatra is one of the most rigorous and readable modern accounts, points out that the snake story was almost certainly Octavian's construction, politically and symbolically useful, adopted by the literary tradition that followed him. Small marks on her arm were noted, but what caused them is genuinely unclear. Plutarch entertains the snake theory but hedges. There is a theory she used poison concealed in a comb. There is a theory she had a snake smuggled in a basket of figs. All of these might be true. None of them can be confirmed. What can be confirmed is this: the image of Cleopatra dying by snakebite, theatrical, exotic, sexualized in later tellings, the ultimate Orientalist spectacle, was the image Octavian needed. It placed her in the register of the dangerous, the Eastern, the not quite civilized. It made her death a kind of seduction even in its final form. She died beautifully, senselessly, by the thing that was always going to kill her, her own exotic nature. That is the story Rome needed. That is the story Rome told. And almost everything else about her, the languages, the governance, the theological seriousness, the genuine geopolitical vision, the library and the intellect, and the long, careful years of holding a kingdom together against forces that should have crushed it, was allowed to sink beneath it. I think about this particular moment more than I probably should. The moment when Charmion adjusted the diadem on her mistress's head and answered the Roman soldier who demanded to know if this was well done. Very well done, and worthy of the descendant of so many kings. She was speaking into a silence that would last centuries. She knew, they all knew, that whatever came next, the story would belong to Rome. But Cleopatra had at least made sure of one thing. She had refused to be carried through their streets. She had refused to be their image. She had died as a pharaoh, dressed as a god, on her own terms, in her own city. That was the one political decision Octavian could not take back. And I think, though we cannot know this, and the historian in me wants to be careful here, I think she knew exactly what she was doing. The records don't tell us what went through her mind in that mausoleum, in that late summer heat, with the sound of Roman soldiers at the door. But the act itself is legible. The deliberateness of it is legible. The diadem, the regalia, the ceremony of the dying, these are not accidents. These are arguments. She was making an argument that Rome would spend the next one. The city arrives before you see it. Standing on the deck of any ship approaching Alexandria in the 1st century BCE, you would smell it first. A warm, complicated smell, salt and cedar, and something sweet underneath. The particular sweetness of a trading port, where grain and spices and dyed cloth and livestock and papyrus all move through the same narrow air. Then you would hear it, the multilingual noise of the ancient world's most ambitious city, a place where Aramaic and Greek and Egyptian and Latin and the languages of the Levantine coast all arrived daily at the same docks, tangled with the sound of timber hulls shifting against stone moorings, the percussion of loading cranes, the bells on the lighthouse at Pharos. The great lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world as the ancient world reckoned them, its fire visible at sea for 50 kilometers, throwing its light across the water like an invitation or a warning. Alexandria was, by any honest measure, the most extraordinary city on earth in this period. It had been built from nothing, planned by Alexander the Great himself, during a brief visit in 331 BCE, and then constructed and elaborated by his successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, into something that had no real precedent. A grid city, a cosmopolitan city, a city that had decided, very early, that knowledge was the resource worth accumulating above all others. And somewhere inside it, in the Palace District, near the Royal Harbour, in the layered and complicated precincts of one of the ancient world's most astonishing institutions, a girl was learning things that would eventually frighten the most powerful empire in the world. Let me tell you about the Mausion, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because without it, you cannot fully understand what Cleopatra was. The word museum comes directly from it, Mausion, the place of the muses. But what the Mausion actually was is quite different from what that word suggests to us now. It was not a place where objects were kept behind glass for visitors to observe in a certain respectful silence. It was a working institution, a research institution, state-funded, under royal patronage, dedicated to the active pursuit of knowledge across every field that the ancient world recognized as a field: philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, music, rhetoric, geography, zoology, botany. They ate together in a common dining hall. They had access to the collection of the library, the Great Library of Alexandria, which occupied a separate but connected complex, and to a botanical garden, and to an observatory, and to rooms designed specifically for dissection and anatomical study. The historian and biographer Stacy Schiff, in her landmark 2010 biography of Cleopatra, describes the Mausion as something like a cross between a modern university and a think tank, though neither of those comparisons quite captures the scale of its ambition. The library itself, let me say something about the library, because the word does not do it justice. The Ptolemaic project was explicit. They wanted every book in the world. Not as a metaphor, literally. Ships arriving in the harbour of Alexandria were boarded, their manuscripts seized and copied. The copies returned to the owners while the originals were added to the collection. Ptolemy III, it is recorded, borrowed the official Athenian state copies of the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, paying a substantial deposit as security, and then kept the originals, returning the copies, forfeiting the deposit without apparent embarrassment. The historian and classicist Lionel Casson wrote about this episode with what I always read as barely concealed delight at the audacity of it. At its height, the library is believed to have held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, though these numbers come from ancient sources that were not always precise, and scholars continue to debate the exact figure. What is not in dispute is the scale of the ambition. The Ptolemies were trying to make Alexandria the center of all human thought, and to a remarkable degree they succeeded. Euclid did his foundational work on geometry there. Eratosthenes, who served as chief librarian and also, in his spare time, calculated the circumference of the Earth to a remarkable degree of accuracy using shadows and a well, worked there. Archimedes may have studied there. The physician Herophilos conducted anatomical research there that would not be surpassed for centuries. This is the institution into which Cleopatra VII Philopator was born. This is the atmosphere in which she grew up. The smell of papyrus and lamp oil, the sound of scholars arguing across dining tables in multiple languages, the specific intellectual pressure of being surrounded by people for whom the life of the mind was the only life worth talking about. Back with our subject now, in the royal palace district of Alexandria, in the decades around 60 BCE. Cleopatra was born, by the most accepted reckoning, in 69 BCE. She was the third child of Ptolemy XII, the king who is remembered by the rather undignified nickname Auletes, the piper or the flute player, a sobriquet that was, in the ancient world, not a compliment. Ptolemy XII was a complex and often compromised ruler, a man who spent significant portions of his reign in Rome seeking the formal recognition of his dynasty, leaving his children in Alexandria, leaving his daughter in a world that ran largely on scholarship and court intrigue and the layered weight of a dynasty 300 years old. What we know about Cleopatra's education comes primarily from inference, and from what she demonstrably knew as an adult, the skills and capacities she displays in the historical record, and from the single most important passage in the ancient literature about her, the account left by Plutarch in his Life of Antony. Plutarch, writing roughly 130 years after her death but drawing on earlier sources now lost to us, describes her as a woman of extraordinary intellectual capability. He notes specifically that she had mastered multiple languages. He gives a number of at least 9, including Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Syriac, Median, and Parthian, as well as the Greek she spoke as her native tongue and the Latin she had acquired, and that she could move between them fluently. He notes that she captivated people through the force of conversation, that her voice itself was musical and compelling, that people left her presence having been, in some genuine sense, persuaded. I find this particular detail from Plutarch genuinely moving, and I want to sit with it for a moment before we go further, because Plutarch was writing within a tradition that had, for more than a century by his time, characterized Cleopatra primarily through her physical presence, through her supposed irresistible beauty, through her effect on the bodies of powerful men. And here he is, almost in spite of that tradition, recording something different, something that the tradition kept almost accidentally, that her power was primarily intellectual, that she could talk to anyone, that the mechanism was conversation, not seduction. The biographer Duane Roller, in his careful 2010 scholarly study of Cleopatra, notes that her linguistic education in particular would have been unusual even within the Mausion's intellectual culture. Languages were not the primary study of Hellenistic scholars, who tended to operate comfortably in Greek, and to regard that as sufficient. Cleopatra's mastery of languages other than Greek, particularly Egyptian, which we will come to properly in the next section, suggests something deliberate, something chosen rather than merely absorbed. She was not simply receiving the education her dynasty had always provided. She was constructing something specific out of that education, building toward a kind of ruler that the Ptolemaic dynasty had never quite produced before. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for how we listen to the rest of this story. We cannot know exactly what the young Cleopatra felt as she moved through the Mausion's colonnades, through the stone corridors that smelled of lamp oil and old scrolls, through the dining halls where the scholars ate and argued at long stone tables. We cannot know whether she felt the particular loneliness that the records, taken together, gently suggest, the loneliness of being, in many rooms she would spend her life moving through, the most educated person present, and of knowing with absolute clarity that this would not be how her power was explained. But the evidence does hint at something worth sitting with. Plutarch records that she could captivate kings and soldiers through argument. The scholar Mary Beard, in her engagement with the ancient sources on Cleopatra, has noted how consistently the non-Roman evidence, the Egyptian temple inscriptions, the coins struck in her own name, the administrative records of her reign, presents a figure of genuine political and intellectual authority, and how consistently the Roman literary tradition translates that authority into something else, something more comfortable, something that does not require Rome to acknowledge that a woman who ruled a rival power was simply more capable than the narrative about her preferred to allow. It is tempting to imagine that she knew this, that she understood, early, what the world would make of her, that she chose her languages and her learning, not despite that knowledge but alongside it, as a kind of private record of what she actually was, maintained beneath whatever the world decided to see. The lamp oil burned in the Mausion's reading halls. The harbour shifted and breathed outside the palace walls. The gulls crossed the lighthouse at Pharos in slow, wide arcs. A girl with a facility for languages and an appetite for argument moved through one of the most remarkable intellectual institutions the ancient world ever built, and was becoming, quietly, something that would take centuries of Roman propaganda to half erase. We will talk about the erasure. The temple at Memphis smelled of incense and river water, and the particular dusty warmth of stone that has held the sun inside itself all day and has not yet released it. The floors were pale limestone, worn smooth by centuries of bare feet. The columns rose in the semi-darkness, their painted surfaces catching the light of oil lamps in amber and ochre and a deep ceremonial red. And somewhere in that space, in a sanctuary where Greek had almost never been spoken by a ruler, let alone something older and stranger and more rooted than Greek, a young woman opened her mouth and addressed the priests in Egyptian, not through an interpreter, not with a phrase rehearsed for ceremony and then set aside, in the language itself. I want to stay with that image for a moment before we move forward, because I think it is one of those details that sounds small and turns out to be enormous. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for roughly 3 centuries before Cleopatra, 275 years or thereabouts, depending on how you count it. That is not a brief administration. That is not a temporary occupation. That is generation after generation of rulers sitting on the throne of the pharaohs, wearing the double crown, accepting the titles, performing the rituals, and doing all of it while refusing, or simply not bothering, to learn the language of the people they governed. I find this genuinely astonishing, not because it is evil. It is not unusual, historically, for a conquering class to maintain its own language as a marker of power, but because of what it reveals about the nature of Ptolemaic Egypt. It was, in a very precise and structural sense, 2 countries occupying the same geography, Greek above, Egyptian below, and the line between them was linguistic, social, legal, and nearly absolute. Cleopatra looked at that arrangement and decided to do something different. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the world the Ptolemaic dynasty had built in Egypt, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because you cannot understand what Cleopatra's choice meant without understanding what she was choosing against. Ptolemy I, the general who founded the dynasty, who had marched with Alexander and inherited his slice of the world, arrived in Egypt in 323 BCE, after Alexander's death, and set about building a kingdom. He was shrewd, capable, and thoroughly Greek in his cultural orientation. Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded on the Mediterranean coast, became his capital, and it was a city designed to announce what Egypt was now becoming, a Greek city, with Greek architecture, Greek administrative language, Greek institutions, a Greek library that would eventually become the greatest repository of human knowledge in the ancient world. The Ptolemies were not, to be clear, indifferent to Egypt. They were not careless conquerors who ignored the country's existing traditions. They were, in fact, quite sophisticated about it. They adopted pharaonic titles. They built and restored Egyptian temples. They participated, at least in outward form, in Egyptian religious ceremonies. They understood that the priestly class, the keepers of the temples, the administrators of religious law, the intermediaries between ordinary Egyptians and the divine, held genuine social power, and they cultivated that class with gifts and building projects and formal recognition. But they did all of this in Greek, or through translators, or in the formal ceremonial gestures that could cross language barriers, the donation, the ritual posture, the offering presented at the correct moment. The historian Adrian Goldsworthy whose work on Julius Caesar and the late Roman Republic has become something of a standard reference for this period, has noted the particular administrative architecture of Ptolemaic Egypt, this bilingual, bicultural structure that worked more or less because both sides had something to gain from it. The Greek-speaking elite gained a wealthy, agriculturally productive kingdom. The Egyptian priestly and administrative class gained institutional recognition and material support from whoever happened to be wearing the crown. It was a transaction. It was not, by and large, a relationship. And the proof of that distinction is the language. You do not bother to learn the language of people you are simply administering. You learn the language of people you genuinely want to reach. The Ptolemies, for nearly 300 years, did not want to reach the Egyptians, or they did not want to badly enough to do the work. Back then to Cleopatra, and to what she did instead. She was born in 69 BCE, the third child, probably, of Ptolemy XII Auletes, a king whose reign was distinguished mainly by its instability and by his expensive, humiliating efforts to secure Roman support for his own throne. She grew up in the palace at Alexandria, which sat on the edge of the Mediterranean, its windows open to the sea air, to the smell of salt and cedar, and the particular cold that comes off deep water, even in a warm climate. The palace complex was vast and many-layered. Libraries, audience chambers, gardens that ran down to private harbours, rooms that smelled of papyrus and lamp oil, and the perfumed oils burned in the small domestic shrines. She was educated in that palace with a thoroughness that the ancient sources, to their credit, actually document. Plutarch, writing in his Life of Antony. Around the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, drawing on earlier accounts that no longer survive, describes her as a woman of formidable intellectual gifts, and he lists the languages she commanded. The exact count varies slightly depending on which translation you are reading, but the substance is consistent. She spoke Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, and at least one or two others. Plutarch's phrasing is that she could speak to most of the peoples who came to her court without requiring an interpreter, and that this was unusual and notable. Unusual. That word is doing rather a lot of work in that sentence. Because what Plutarch is quietly recording, this man writing more than a century after her death, working from sources we no longer have, is that Cleopatra's linguistic capacity was remarkable by the standards of any ruler of her era, not just by the standards of the Ptolemies, by any standard. The Egyptologists and classicists who have written most carefully about this detail in recent decades, Stacy Schiff, in her luminous 2010 biography, Cleopatra, A Life, and Dwayne Roller in his more technically focused Cleopatra, A Biography. Published the same year, both emphasize the particular significance of the Egyptian language itself. Greek she would have spoken from infancy. Latin she acquired as a matter of political pragmatism. But Egyptian, the language of the majority of the people she ruled, the language of the priests and the farmers and the administrators and the scribes who kept the country running, Egyptian was a choice. It was sustained effort over years. It required teachers, practice, the willingness to sound uncertain and to get things wrong before getting them right. The cold stone underfoot, the lamplight moving in a draught from somewhere, the smell of the burning wicks, that particular slightly acrid warmth, and the sound of a young Ptolemaic queen forming syllables that her father had not formed, that his father had not formed, that no one in her direct line had bothered to form for longer than anyone at court could personally remember. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters for how we hold this image. We cannot know, with certainty, what Cleopatra's private motivation was. We do not have her diaries. We do not have letters in which she reflects on why she made this choice. The record, already partial, already filtered through sources hostile or simply indifferent to her inner life, does not preserve her reasoning in her own voice. It almost never does, for any woman of the ancient world. What the record does preserve is the pattern of choices she made, and what those choices add up to. She learned Egyptian. She engaged with the Egyptian priestly class directly, in ways that went beyond ceremony. She participated in Egyptian religious traditions, something we will spend real time on in the next section, because it is one of the most fascinating and most erased dimensions of who she was. She presented herself, consistently and deliberately, as a ruler of Egypt, in a way that no Ptolemaic ruler before her had quite managed or attempted. Not a ruler over Egypt, a ruler of it. It is tempting to say this was purely strategic, and perhaps it was, in part. A ruler who can speak directly to priests, to regional administrators, to the representatives of the country's largest and most politically significant religious class, without going through a translator, is a ruler who has more information, more flexibility, more reach. The political calculation is not hard to understand. But I find something in the sustained nature of the effort worth sitting with. Learning a language, genuinely learning it, to the level of fluency that allows you to conduct diplomatic and religious business without an intermediary, is not something you accomplish in an afternoon. It is years of work, it is hours of practice when you could be doing something else. It requires, on some level, caring. It requires finding the language worth the effort of entry. Stacy Schiff writes, with her characteristic precision, that Cleopatra may have been the only member of her dynasty who bothered, and that this fact alone distinguishes her from the rulers who preceded her in ways that Roman sources were, later, deeply invested in obscuring. Because if Cleopatra was genuinely actively Egyptian, not a Greek woman who happened to sit on Egypt's throne, but a ruler who had reached across the cultural divide her ancestors maintained, then the Roman framing of her as a foreign seductress, as an Eastern temptress whose power over Roman men was a kind of exotic contamination, collapses. It collapses completely. She was not foreign to Egypt. She was, in the smell reaches you before anything else. That is the thing about Kaifi, the sacred incense of the Egyptian temple, that no description quite prepares you for. It is not a single note. It is not the clean, clarifying smoke of a single herb. Kaifi is a compound, and ancient sources including the physician Dioscorides and the philosopher Plutarch both describe its making with a kind of reverence. 16 ingredients, combined according to a ritual as precise and as old as the temple walls themselves. Honey, wine, raisins soaked until they swell and soften, myrrh, frankincense, juniper berries, cinnamon. The exact proportions guarded by the priestly class, the way some things are always guarded, not from greed, but because the knowledge itself was considered sacred. The smell of Kaifi burning is sweet and resinous and deep, and it carries in it something that ancient Egyptians believed was the smell of the gods paying attention. Narrator voice. It is, perhaps, late afternoon, the particular quality of Egyptian light at that hour, thick, golden, almost physical in its weight, presses through the outer courts of the temple complex at Dendera, falling in long, slanted columns through the hypostyle hall, where the stone columns rise wide as the oldest trees. The stone itself holds the cool of the night inside it, even now, even as the afternoon heat presses from outside. And through the hall, through the sanctuaries, through the carefully arranged spaces that the ancient architects designed to move the worshipper through degrees of diminishing light and increasing holiness, the Kaifi moves like something with its own intention, coiling upward in ropes of smoke that catch the late light and dissolve into the painted ceiling above. She is here, not in the way a visitor is here, not in the way even a queen might be here. The woman who will move through this space today has spent years learning what it means to arrive in a place like this, as something more than human. The distinction matters. To the priests who serve this temple, to the ordinary people of Egypt who will hear of this visit, and whose world is ordered entirely around the idea that certain figures stand at the boundary between the human and the divine. To all of them, what enters the Dendera temple complex today is not simply a monarch performing a duty. What enters is Isis, incarnate, present, walking in the world in the body of a woman. I want to spend some time here because I think this is one of the dimensions of Cleopatra's story that gets most thoroughly lost, and most deliberately so. When we talk about the real Cleopatra, we tend to concentrate on the political strategist, the linguist, the military thinker, and all of that is genuinely important. But her religious identity, her identity as Isis incarnate, was not a costume she put on for political convenience. The evidence suggests it was a fully realized theological and political project, something she built and inhabited with real care, over years, in a way that connected her to something ancient and enormous. And when Rome looked at that, it did not see a queen enacting a religious tradition. It saw something threatening enough to mock, to suppress, and eventually to erase. Let me tell you about Isis, because I think if you understand who Isis actually was, what she meant to the ancient world, you will understand exactly why Cleopatra's identification with her was so powerful, and exactly why Rome found it so difficult to bear. Digression. Isis is one of the oldest of the Egyptian deities. Her origins stretch back into the earliest periods of Egyptian religious life, and by the 1st century BCE, she had become, arguably, the most widely worshipped goddess in the Mediterranean world. Her mythology is vast and interlocking, and deeply human in its emotional register. She is the devoted wife who searches the world for the scattered pieces of her husband Osiris, after he is murdered and dismembered by his brother Set. She is the mother of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, whom she protects from the violence of Set with fierce maternal intelligence. She is a healer, she is a magician. In Egyptian religious tradition, she is sometimes described as more powerful in magic than even the sun god Ra. She is the one who knows how to restore what has been lost, how to make the dead live again. She is the queen of heaven and earth and the underworld. And she is, crucially, the divine queen. The pharaoh of Egypt was, in the Egyptian theological system, the living Horus, the divine sun, and the queen was, by extension, identified with Isis. This was not a metaphor. It was a statement about the nature of reality. What is genuinely remarkable, and this is a detail I find fascinating, is the reach of Isis worship by the 1st century BCE. The cult of Isis had spread outward from Egypt across the entire Mediterranean basin. She had temples in Greece. She had temples in Rome itself. The Roman Senate, in various moments of political anxiety, periodically suppressed the cult of Isis in the city. There are records of this in the years 58, 53, 50, and 48 BCE. Temples demolished or altars thrown from the Capitoline Hill, which is itself a kind of testimony to how popular she had become. You do not suppress a goddess nobody cares about. The Roman suppression of Isis worship in Rome is, when you sit with it, rather extraordinary. Here is Rome, repeatedly destroying temples to the same goddess that its eventual greatest enemy claimed as her divine identity. The anxiety runs deep and early. When Cleopatra presented herself as Isis, then she was not reaching for an obscure local deity. She was reaching for the most widely recognized divine feminine in the known world. She was saying, "I am this, the mother, the healer, the queen who restores the dead, the one who knows the secret name of God." Back to our subject. The temple complex at Dendera, Eunet in the ancient Egyptian, was sacred to the goddess Hathor, who, in Egyptian religious thought, was closely associated with Isis, the two goddesses, sometimes merging, sometimes distinguished. Cleopatra contributed to the construction of this temple, and what survives there, what still stands there, today, in the Egyptian desert, includes one of the most important pieces of physical evidence we have about how Cleopatra chose to present herself to her own people. On the exterior rear wall of the temple at Dendera, there is a carved relief. It is large, it is formal. It shows Cleopatra VII and her son Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, and who was recognized in Egypt as co-ruler, performing religious rites. And in this relief, Cleopatra is shown as a pharaoh. not as a consort, not as a decorative figure in the background. She stands in the full regalia of the Egyptian divine ruler, the double crown, the ritual garments, her posture straight and forward-facing in the precise formal manner that Egyptian religious art had used for 3,000 years to depict those who stood in the presence of the gods. Her proportions are powerful. Her position is authoritative. This is not seduction. This is sovereignty. Host voice. The historian Stacy Schiff, in her 2010 biography of Cleopatra, notes that the Dendera relief is one of those images that stops you, or it should, because here is Cleopatra in stone, in her own image, commissioned under her own authority, presenting herself to her own people in the language her people understood. And the figure you see there has nothing to do with the figure that Roman poets would spend decades constructing, the lustful Eastern queen, the dangerous temptress, the woman whose sexuality was her only political instrument. The woman on the wall at Dendera is performing a sacred duty. She is a pharaoh in the presence of the divine. She is doing what pharaohs had done for millennia. I find this genuinely moving, and I want to be honest with you about why. It is partly the image itself, but it is also something about intention. We cannot know for certain what Cleopatra thought about the permanence of stone versus the impermanence of everything else. We cannot know what she believed about the survival of her own story. But the biographer Schiff has noted, and I think she is right, that there is something in the sheer scale and formality of the Dendera relief, something in the choice to carve yourself in this way, in this place, that suggests a woman who understood that the official written record was not fully under her control, and who chose stone as a different kind of argument. Stone lasts. The papyrus might not. The Roman version of you might drown out everything else. But the stone, if it survives, will say what you chose to say. The weight of the double crown in late afternoon sun is not something easily imagined from the outside. The Atef crown, a white crown flanked by ostrich feathers, fitted with a sun disk, is tall, elaborate, ceremonially heavy. The gold and the feathers and the careful construction of it press down on the head with the particular weight of something that was made not to be comfortable but to be seen, to be recognized, to communicate, to every eye that fell upon the figure wearing it, something beyond the merely human. She wears it in the relief at Dendera, her form translated into the timeless formal idiom of Egyptian sacred art. Around her, carved into the warm limestone, the hieroglyphs record her titles, her offerings to the goddess. The language she is speaking in this moment is not Greek, the language of her dynasty's administration, the language of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy for 300 years. It is Egyptian, the priestly language, the language of the temple. The coin is small, smaller than you probably imagine. Hold it in the center of your palm and it would not quite reach your outermost finger lines. Bronze, or sometimes silver, worn at the edges where 100 hands have passed it along. A merchant in Alexandria, a soldier on campaign, a woman buying figs in a market whose name no one recorded. It is cool to the touch. It has the particular dense heaviness of struck metal, heavier than its size suggests, the way a river stone is always heavier than you expect when you lift it from the water. And on one face, pressed into that metal in shallow, precise relief, is a face. Not the face you have been given. Not the face that 2,000 years of painting, sculpture, theatre and cinema placed so firmly in the imagination that most people carry it like a fact. This face is different. The nose is strong, emphatically strong, what the numismatists and art historians who have spent their careers studying these coins will simply call a prominent nose, a commanding nose. The jaw is firm. The expression, insofar as a struck bronze portrait from the 1st century BCE can carry expression, is one of absolute authority. This is not a face arranged to please. This is a face arranged to govern. I want to stop here, right at the beginning of this section, and sit with you in something I find genuinely extraordinary. The most famous thing ever said about Cleopatra's face, the most quoted, most repeated, most poetically admired observation about her physical appearance is Blaise Pascal's line from the Pensée, written in the 17th century, that if Cleopatra's nose had been shorter, the whole face of the earth would have been different. Pascal meant it as a philosophical point about the contingency of history, about how the great turning points of empires hang on the smallest accidents of biology and desire. It is a beautiful line. It is also, in a way that I find both quietly funny and quietly devastating, a line written about a nose that Pascal had never seen, in a face that exists nowhere in the tradition he was drawing from. The Roman literary sources, Plutarch, Dio Cassius, the poets, tell us almost nothing concrete about what Cleopatra looked like. What Pascal was imagining, what all of Western culture has been imagining, is largely an invention. The real nose, the actual nose, pressed into actual metal under Cleopatra's own authority, is formidable. She chose it. That is the part I keep returning to. These coins were produced under her direction. She approved the die. She saw the portrait before it circulated, and the portrait she approved looks like this: strong, assertive, unmistakably commanding. There was nothing accidental about it. This was, as the scholar Duane Roller has observed in his careful study of the Ptolemaic coinage, a deliberate act of political self-presentation. The most famous observation about her face describes a face that never existed. The real face was something she chose, and it has been sitting in museum drawers and display cases for 2 centuries, waiting. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about how ancient coinage worked, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because understanding it changes what these coins mean. We live in an age of images so saturated that we have almost stopped seeing them. A political leader's face appears on a screen, in a newspaper, on a billboard, in a social media feed, dozens of times before breakfast. We are drowning in portraits, but the ancient world was visually sparse in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct. Most people in the 1st century BCE would have had no reliable way to know what their ruler looked like. There were statues in public spaces, yes. There were carved reliefs on temple walls. There were occasionally painted portraits displayed in civic buildings. But these were fixed, local, inaccessible to most of the population most of the time. The coin was different. The coin moved. A coin pressed in Alexandria in 47 BCE might, within months, be in the hand of a trader in Antioch, a legionary in Syria, a farmer in Cyprus paying his taxes. Coins were the ancient world's only truly mass-distributed image technology, the closest thing antiquity had to a broadcast. When a ruler put their portrait on a coin, they were not making a decorative choice. They were sending their face into every market, every transaction, every pocket and purse and money pouch across the entire territory their currency reached. Scholars of ancient political communication, and this is a field that has grown considerably in the last 3 decades, have increasingly emphasized this point. The coin portrait was, as the historian Paul Zanker argued in his influential work on Augustan image-making, the most powerful and pervasive political communication tool available in the ancient world. And it worked in both directions. Putting your face on a coin was an assertion of sovereignty. It said, "This territory is mine. This currency flows from my authority. My face is the guarantee of its value." In the Hellenistic world, this tradition descended directly from Alexander the Great, who had been among the first rulers to place his own image on coinage during his lifetime. The Ptolemaic dynasty had maintained this tradition. Cleopatra's face on her coins was not vanity. It was a statement of political theology. Back to our subject then, and to what the coins actually show us. There are surviving examples of Cleopatra's coins in collections across the world, in the British Museum, in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, in collections in Berlin and Paris, and in smaller regional museums that acquired them during the great period of 19th century excavation. The numismatic scholar Guy Weil Grayson has been among those who have examined these coins with particular care, and the portrait tradition they represent is strikingly consistent. Cleopatra is shown in profile, in the Hellenistic manner. She wears a diadem, the white band that was the traditional mark of Hellenistic royalty. Her hair is pulled back, often in what is called a melon coiffure, the sections of hair arranged in neat, parallel waves. And her features are, across multiple dyes and multiple minting locations, distinctly strong. The nose, the jaw, the set of the mouth. Now here is the detail I have been saving, and it is the one that stops me every time I encounter it. On the joint coinage issued by Cleopatra and Mark Antony during the years of their political and personal alliance, coins that bore both their portraits, coins that were a statement of shared authority across the Eastern Mediterranean, Cleopatra's portrait, in several surviving examples, is the larger of the two. Her face takes up more of the coin's face than his does. Think about what that means in terms of the grammar of ancient political imagery. These were not coins issued by Antony on which Cleopatra appeared as a consort or a companion. They were coins in which the compositional hierarchy, the simple, ancient, universally understood language of who takes up more space, placed her as the primary figure. The biographer Stacy Schiff, in her meticulous 2010 study of Cleopatra, noted this detail with appropriate emphasis. Cleopatra was not positioning herself beside Antony. She was positioning herself as the senior partner, and she was doing it in the medium that would carry that message the farthest and the longest. This is the counter-record. This is what survives outside the Roman literary tradition. When Octavian's propagandists, and then Virgil, and then Horace, and then Propertius, constructed the image of Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress, Meretrix Regina, the prostitute queen, as Propertius called her, the Eastern temptress, who had unmanned first Caesar and then Antony with her foreign wiles, they were working against an existing image. Her image, an image she had deliberately, carefully, authoritatively created and circulated in metal across the known world. The coins are not romantic, they are not seductive, they are not designed to enchant, they are designed to command. And the woman looking out from them, the woman who approved this likeness, who sent this face into every market and every army camp and every tax collector's strongbox within her reach, is not the woman that Rome spent 3 centuries writing about. I find something in this genuinely moving, and I want to try to be precise about why. It is not simply that the Roman account was wrong, or exaggerated, or propagandistic, though it was all of those things, and the next section will go deeper into exactly how and why. It is something more specific than that. It is that she left us a rebuttal. She pressed it into bronze and silver and sent it walking through the world. She could not have known, obviously, what would happen, that the literary tradition would outlast the coins, that the coins would spend centuries in the dark before anyone thought to read them as political documents rather than archaeological curiosities. She couldn't have known that. But she made the record anyway. She asserted her own likeness with the most durable technology available to her, in the medium that travelled farthest and lasted longest, and she made herself look exactly as she wished to be seen. The coin sits in your palm, cool and heavy. The face in the metal looks nowhere but forward. The grain came first. Before the politics, before the children, before the wars, understand the grain. Stand for a moment in your imagination, inside one of the great warehouses at Alexandria's harbour. It is summer. The air is thick and warm and golden with dust, the way grain dust always is, catching the light at a particular angle that makes it look almost edible, almost holy. The smell is enormous, dry and sweet and ancient, the smell of bread not yet baked, of months and seasons compressed into kernel and husk. The warehouse is not quiet. There are workers and measurements and the rough drag of sacks across stone floors. And beyond the open loading doors, visible if you look, the harbour is full of ships sitting low in the water, heavy with what the Mediterranean world quite literally could not live without. This is what Rome was actually afraid of. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about grain in the ancient world, because I genuinely believe it is one of those subjects that transforms everything around it the moment you understand it properly. The ancient Mediterranean ran on wheat, not metaphorically, physically, structurally. The entire political architecture of every empire that touched that sea was built on a foundation of grain supply. An army without bread was not an army. A city without bread was not a city for long. Rome, by the late 1st century BCE, had somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million inhabitants. The specific number historians debate, but the scale is not seriously disputed. And that city, that enormous consuming city, could not feed itself. The Italian peninsula around it could not feed it either. Not at that scale. Rome required imports, always, constantly, annually. The grain came from several places, from Sicily, from Sardinia, from North Africa, around Carthage. But Egypt was in a category entirely its own. The Nile did something that no other river in the Mediterranean world did with such reliability and such generosity. Every year between June and September, it flooded, not catastrophically, predictably. The floodwaters carried silt down from the mountains of East Africa, rich, dark, mineral-dense silt, and deposited it across the farmland of the Nile Delta and the valley south of it. When the waters receded, they left behind what Egyptian farmers called the Black Land, Kemet, as distinct from the Red Land, the desert. And that Black Land was extraordinarily, almost unfairly, productive. Egyptian wheat yields in antiquity were among the highest in the ancient world. The agricultural historian and classicist Roger Bagnall, among others, has documented the degree to which Egyptian grain production existed on a different scale from anywhere else Rome drew its food. Egypt fed perhaps 1/3 of Rome's grain requirements at points during the imperial period. Some estimates put it higher. The historian Paul Erdkamp, in his substantial work on the Roman grain market, emphasizes something that tends to get lost in the more dramatic narratives of the period. Grain supply was not a background condition of Roman power. It was the central nervous system of Roman power. Control grain, and you did not merely make money. You held something very close to life and death over the largest city the Western world had ever built. Cleopatra understood this, completely, fluently, in the way that someone understands an instrument they have been playing their whole life. She had come to power young and precarious, displaced by her younger brother's faction, briefly exiled from Alexandria. The circumstances of her return, in the rolled carpet or the sacking, the historians debate the detail but not the essential audacity of it, placed her before Julius Caesar not as a suppliant, but as a sovereign intelligence with something specific to offer: Egypt. All of it, the grain, the harbours, the wealth, the eastern trade routes, the particular strategic position of Alexandria at the junction between the Mediterranean and everything east of it. She was 21. She had already understood something that Caesar, for all his genius, was in the process of discovering: that the Roman world had grown large enough that it could only be governed from multiple centres of power, or it would simply keep tearing itself apart in civil war. The warmth of Alexandria in winter is particular, softer than Rome, the Mediterranean light landing differently here, the harbour always carrying a faint salt smell under the grain dust and the incense from the temple precincts. She walked through a city that was, in the 1st century BCE, probably the greatest city in the world by most measures that matter. Its library, its philosophers, its physicians, its harbour technology, its sheer productive capacity. She walked through it as its pharaoh, not its administrator. The distinction mattered enormously to her. The distinction was, in fact, the whole argument. Her relationship with Caesar lasted roughly 2 years and produced a son. The boy was called Ptolemy Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. He was born in 47 BCE. She brought the child to Rome and stayed there, in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, for perhaps 2 years. Roman society found this uncomfortable in ways it couldn't quite articulate. and so it articulated it in the ways that have always been available, as scandal, as seduction, as impropriety. But what Cleopatra was doing in Rome was not seduction. It was geopolitics conducted in person. She was watching how Rome worked, who held power, how it moved. She was gathering the particular kind of knowledge that only proximity gives you. Then Caesar was murdered, and everything shifted. I want to be honest with you about something. When we come to Mark Antony, and we are coming to him now, it is almost impossible to hear clearly through the noise that Rome subsequently made about this particular relationship. Antony has been painted as a man undone by passion, a soldier corrupted by luxury and the East, a Roman who forgot himself. The painting was done by Octavian's propaganda team, working with considerable skill and considerable urgency, and it has been extraordinarily durable. But I genuinely think, that if you clear away some of that paint, what you find underneath is something more interesting and more frightening to Rome than any love story. What you find is a plan. Narrator: by 41 BCE, Cleopatra was 30 years old. Antony had summoned her to the city of Tarsus in southern Anatolia, a meeting he framed as an accountability session, a Roman general requiring a client monarch to explain her recent neutrality in the wars between the triumvirs. She understood the framing exactly, and she arrived at Tarsus in a way that made clear, in the language of spectacle that both Egypt and Rome fluently spoke, that whatever Antony thought this meeting was about, she had different ideas. The ancient accounts of her arrival at Tarsus, Plutarch's especially, which later gave Shakespeare his most famous lines, are layered through with the particular gold dust of legendary retelling. But beneath the poetry, the political content is precise. She arrived not as a client, but as a sovereign. She arrived as Isis incarnate, as a goddess queen conducting a meeting with a Roman general on terms she had set. The silver-oared barge, the purple sails, the incense drifting across the harbour to the watching crowds on the riverbank. These were not vanity. They were carefully composed political communication. She had something to offer Antony that no one else could. Egypt's resources, Egypt's wealth, Egypt's administrative capacity, and crucially, Egypt's geographical position as the hinge between the Roman world and the immensely wealthy kingdoms of the East. Parthia, Judea, Armenia, the trade routes to Arabia and India. She understood that Antony wanted to do what Caesar had been planning before his death, a great Eastern campaign, the conquest of Parthia, the extension of Roman power to its furthest possible horizon. She understood that without her, he could not do it. With her, he might, and she intended to be indispensable. The relationship that followed, lasting through the births of their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, in 40 BCE, and their youngest son Ptolemy Philadelphus, in 36 BCE, was a long, complex, politically productive partnership. It was also, by most accounts that try to be honest about it, a genuine and deep personal attachment. These things are not mutually exclusive. History tends to insist on a binary. Either it was real love or it was cold strategy, as though human beings, even extraordinary ones, cannot manage both simultaneously. But the moment I want to take you to is 34 BCE, the donations of Alexandria. I have been saving this particular detail, and I find that every time I return to it, it looks slightly larger than it did before. Picture the gymnasium in Alexandria, a great public space, the kind of formal architectural setting that Hellenistic rulers used for major political announcements. The air in Alexandria in late summer still carries the harbour, the salt of it, the faint sweetness of grain from the waterfront warehouses a few streets away. Antony is present in his capacity as Roman general and triumvir. Cleopatra is present as pharaoh and queen. Their children are present. And what is announced, publicly, formally, in the full theatre of royal proclamation, is one of the most extraordinary political acts of the ancient world. Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Coele Syria. He declared Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, her co-ruler, and legitimate son of Caesar, and heir to his legacy. And he distributed Rome's eastern territories Rome considered its own, to his and Cleopatra's children. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and Parthia, including Parthia, which Rome had not yet conquered, in a gesture that was either, "There is a particular kind of silence that follows children. Not the silence of an empty room, that is simply quiet. I mean the other kind. The kind that has a shape to it, a pressure, because the room was not always empty, because someone small used to move through it, leaving behind the particular disorder of a life being actively, joyfully lived. A sandal in the wrong place, a cup set down without thought, the specific echo of a space that remembers what it held." I want you to hold that kind of silence as we move through this section, because what was erased through Cleopatra's children was not just 4 individual lives, though it was that. It was a world, a set of futures, a version of the Mediterranean that very nearly came to exist and then was closed, deliberately and violently, by the people who won. She had 4 children. This is worth saying plainly, because the Roman literary tradition that shaped everything that came after had very little interest in Cleopatra as a mother. She was a seductress, a threat, a foreign queen who had destabilized 2 of Rome's greatest men. The children were inconvenient complications to a clean narrative, so the Roman sources mostly left them at the edges, mentioned, not dwelt upon, certainly not mourned. But they existed, they were real, and their fates are among the most quietly devastating details in this entire story. The eldest was Caesarion. His full name, the one Cleopatra gave him, the one she insisted upon, was Ptolemy XV, Philopator Caesar. He was born in 47 BCE, roughly 9 months after Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, and the two forged whatever it was they forged between them. A political alliance, certainly. A personal relationship, almost certainly. The precise nature of which ancient sources disagree about, and modern historians continue to debate. Cleopatra called the boy Caesarion, Little Caesar. The diminutive form carries something almost unbearably tender in it. He was small, once. He was new, once. She held his weight in her arms and gave him a name that meant everything about who she needed him to be. The Alexandrian air in that summer of 47 BCE would have smelled of the river, the Nile's particular mineral green smell, the smell of fertile silt that the Egyptians called the gift of the god, and of the sea, and of the city itself, that great metropolitan tangle of papyrus and fish sauce and lamp oil, and the saltstone smell of buildings that had stood for 3 centuries. Into all of that, a child arrived, and Cleopatra understood immediately what he was. He was not simply her son, he was the embodiment of a possible world. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is the part of this story I find genuinely the most difficult to sit with. Cleopatra spent considerable political energy making Caesarion's parentage visible and official. She took him to Rome in 46 BCE. She was there, in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, with her infant son, for roughly 2 years, until Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. Think about what that means for a moment. She was not hiding, she was not being kept quietly out of sight. She was there, with the child, in the city, in Caesar's house, while Caesar himself was at the height of his power, and his enemies were sharpening their knives in the dark of Senate corridors that smelled of old marble and lamp smoke and ambition. Caesar acknowledged Caesarion's existence. He did not, however, name him in his will. He named his great-nephew Octavian as his heir instead. Let me tell you something about why this matters, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising if you haven't come across it before. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the particular legal and political electricity that surrounded Caesarion's existence, because it is one of those details that, once you understand it, reframes almost everything that happened next. When Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March 44 BCE, The question of who would inherit his name, his political legitimacy, his extraordinary accumulated authority became instantly the most dangerous question in the Roman world. Caesar had not legally acknowledged Caesarion as his son, but that was different from saying the boy was not his son. It was a distinction Romans understood. Legally, the heir was Octavian, but biologically, and this was the explosive charge buried in the situation, there was a boy in Alexandria who was Caesar's blood. Cleopatra knew this. Octavian knew this, and once Octavian began consolidating his power after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE, the boy's existence became not merely inconvenient, but existentially threatening to everything Octavian was building. He was building an identity as Caesar's son. He would eventually take the name Augustus, and the authority of the Caesarian inheritance was central to his legitimacy. He had been adopted posthumously in Caesar's will. He was Caesar's heir by legal designation. But there was a 17-year-old in Alexandria who was Caesar's heir by blood. Caesarion, at the time of Actium, was in his late adolescence. Cleopatra had, according to some ancient sources, sent him away from Alexandria toward the end, trying to keep him safe, perhaps toward India or somewhere beyond Rome's reach. The plan failed. After Alexandria fell, Octavian's men found him, or lured him back, and he was killed. Octavian is reported to have consulted advisors and philosophers about what to do. The answer he received has come down to us. Stacy Schiff, in her biography of Cleopatra, cites the ancient account, and it is among the bleakest pieces of political philosophy in the ancient record. The response was something to the effect of, "Multiple Caesars is not good." The philosopher's words have survived, the boy's face has not. He was 17 years old. Let me bring you back now to Alexandria, in the weeks before the end. The palace would have been holding its breath. That is the only phrase that fits. The sounds of a functioning court, of children's feet on stone floors that had been worn smooth by 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule, were giving way to something else. The smell of incense from the temples was still present, threading through the sea air, but underneath it, something sharper, something with the quality of ending. Cleopatra had 3 other children besides Caesarion. All 3 were by Mark Antony. Twins, born in 40 BCE, a boy named Alexander Helios, Alexander the Sun, and a girl named Cleopatra Selene, Cleopatra the Moon, and then a younger son, born around 36 BCE, named Ptolemy Philadelphus. The names she gave them deserve a moment's attention. Alexander Helios was named for Alexander the Great, the mythic ancestor figure of the Macedonian world, and for the sun god. Cleopatra Selene carried her mother's own name and the moon's. Ptolemy Philadelphus echoed the dynasty's founders. These were not simply names. They were a cosmology. They were a statement about who these children were and what world their mother intended them to inherit. In 34 BCE, Antony staged a public ceremony in Alexandria that Roman sources reported with barely concealed outrage. It is known to history as the Donations of Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones on a raised platform in the gymnasium, and their children were given titles and territories. Caesarion was named co-ruler of Egypt and Cyprus and given the title King of Kings. Alexander Helios was given Armenia and Media and Parthia, much of it territory not yet actually conquered, which Roman critics noted with contempt, but which represented an enormous geopolitical vision. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus, still very young, was given Syria and Cilicia. This was Cleopatra's world made visible. Not a seductress's fantasy, a sovereign's blueprint, an Eastern empire, a new political order centered not on Rome but on Alexandria, with her children as its inheritors and its proof. Octavian's propaganda machine was already working before Actium. After Actium, it accelerated, and the children became, in that propaganda, Afterthoughts, footnotes, the embarrassing offspring of Roman degeneracy and Eastern excess. I find this genuinely moving, and I want to try to say why. After Alexandria fell and Cleopatra was dead and Octavian was making his plans, 3 of her 4 children were taken to Rome. Caesarion was dead, but Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were placed in the care of Octavia, Mark Antony's Roman wife. The woman Antony had left for Cleopatra. They were raised, according to the sources, in Octavia's household. The detail is almost too strange for fiction. The historian Duane Roller, in his study of Cleopatra, notes that Octavia raised the children with apparent genuine care, which only deepens the strangeness. The children of the woman who had displaced her, raised in her house, in Rome, in the city their mother had spent her entire political life trying to prevent from swallowing the world that Egypt represented. They walked through Roman rooms, breathed Roman air, were educated in the Roman way, were given, presumably, the Roman version of their parents. The stylus moved across the wax tablet, with a sound like a whisper, like someone turning a secret over in their hands. A scratch, a pause, a scratch again. The room was small and lit by a single oil lamp, and the light it threw was the colour of honey, warm and slightly amber, pooling on the wooden writing surface and the edge of a hand. The smell of the room was ink and candle tallow and, beneath that, something older, the dry papyrus smell of Rome at night, when the city had quieted enough that you could hear a stylus moving in a private room. This is where the poets worked. This is where the damage was done. I want to sit with you in this for a moment, because I think this is one of the most genuinely strange and uncomfortable facts in the entire story we have been telling tonight. The image of Cleopatra that survived, the one that would echo through Shakespeare, through Renaissance painting, through every half-remembered school lesson and Hollywood production, that image was not built by generals or bureaucrats. It was not carved into stone by imperial decree. It was built by poets, some of the most gifted poets who ever wrote in the Latin language, men who understood beauty the way a surgeon understands anatomy, precisely, completely, with the knowledge of exactly where it would hurt. Horace, Virgil, Propertius. And what I find genuinely difficult to hold in my head, what I think about more than I probably should, is that the most magnificent Latin ever written about Cleopatra is also, simultaneously, some of the most effective propaganda in the history of the ancient world. These are not crude attacks. They are not pamphlets. They are works of art, and that is precisely why they worked, and precisely why they lasted. Beauty, in this case, was the instrument of erasure. The narrator voice, Horace first. The ode is known by its opening line, Nunc est bibendum. Now we must drink. It was written sometime around 30 BCE, in the immediate aftermath of Actium, in the fever of victory. The room where Horace wrote it was probably in or near Rome, lit by that same low amber light, with the smell of wine and warmed olive wood in the air, and the sound of a city that had just exhaled, a city that had been genuinely afraid, for years, of what might come from the east, and was now celebrating the fact that it had not. Horace begins with joy. The defeat of Antony and Cleopatra is the occasion for celebration, for wine, for garlands. And then, precisely then, he introduces her. She is not named in the ode. She does not need to be. Everyone knew. He calls her, and this is the phrase that mattered, the phrase that lasted. Fatale monstrum. The fatal monster. A queen who was drunk on sweet fortune and made insane by hope. A woman who plotted the ruin of Rome, who moved through the world with a filthy flock of diseased men around her. The language is coarse, loaded, and precise in its targets. Her sexuality, her foreignness, her supposed excess. And then, and this is the part that makes the ode genuinely difficult to dismiss, he shifts. In the final stanzas, Horace's tone changes. Cleopatra is dying. She has faced Octavian's fleet, seen her ruin, and chosen death over the humiliation of a Roman triumph. And Horace, watching her make that choice, finds something he did not expect to find, something that reads, in the Latin, very much like respect. He writes that she was not broken, that she was not terrified, that she handled the serpents calmly, that she died like a queen. The poem is still propaganda. Do not lose hold of that. The fatal monster is still the fatal monster, even when Horace softens at the end. But the ambivalence in that final movement, that flicker of what might be genuine admiration, is one of those details that makes me think we are dealing with something more complicated than a simple court poet simply doing what he was told. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about the relationship between Augustus and the poets of his age, because I think you'll find it genuinely surprising, and because it matters enormously to how we read everything that was written about Cleopatra in this period. Augustus was, among other things, a patron of literature on a scale that Rome had rarely seen. His close associate Maecenas, wealthy, politically connected, and possessed of what appears to have been genuine aesthetic taste, functioned as a kind of cultural intermediary, bringing poets into the orbit of power. Horace was under Maecenas' patronage. Virgil was under Maecenas' patronage. Propertius received support from the same network. But here is what scholars have spent considerable energy debating. How much does patronage mean? Does it mean control? Does it mean instruction? Write this, write about this, frame it this way. Or is it more ambient, more atmospheric, a world in which certain subjects and certain framings simply become the natural air a poet breathes? The classicist Jasper Griffin, writing about the Augustan poets, has argued that the relationship was far more complex and far more interesting than simple court compliance. And the scholar Alessandro Barchiesi, working on Virgil and the politics of epic, has been particularly careful to point out how often these texts open spaces of ambiguity, moments where the imperial message seems, from the inside, to be pressured, complicated, questioned, not undermined exactly, not subverted in any clean, obvious way, but something more subtle, a kind of loyalty that also contains, somewhere in its structure, the ghost of a reservation. What this means is that when we read the Augustan poets on Cleopatra, we cannot say simply, these men were mouthpieces, but we also cannot say, these men were secret resistors, covertly sympathetic, writing in code. The truth is that we don't fully know. What we do know is that they were brilliant, that they were inside the system, that they had reasons both genuine and practical to celebrate the new order, and that the image of Cleopatra they produced was devastating and lasting regardless of whatever complexity may have lived in their private thoughts. Let me bring you back now to the room with the oil lamp and the smell of warm wax. Virgil's contribution is embedded in the 8th book of the Aeneid, in a passage describing the divine shield that Vulcan forges for Aeneas, a shield that depicts prophetically the whole future of Rome. At the center of that future, at the climax of the shield's imagery, is the Battle of Actium, and there, among the flashing bronze and the ore-churned sea, is Cleopatra. Virgil does not name her either. He calls her Regina. The queen, and he shows her commanding her fleet, calling up her people, not yet seeing the twin serpents that wait for her at the end. Against her stands Octavian, aligned with the gods of Rome, with Apollo at his side. Against her stands, in the logic of the poem, everything civilized, divinely ordered, Roman. She is the chaos against which Rome defines itself, the barbarian East against which Roman virtue becomes legible, becomes necessary, becomes heroic. The scholar Mary Beard has written with characteristic precision about how the Aeneid encodes the founding ideology of the Augustan state, and how Virgil's version of Actium functions as something close to myth-making. The battle on the shield is not history. It is better than history. It is the story history was always supposed to tell. Rome as the rightful heir of divine order, its enemies as the forces of Eastern dissolution. This is magnificent writing. Read the Latin, if you have the patience for it. The hexameters move like a river over stone, smooth and relentless and beautiful. And embedded in that beauty, invisible to most of those who encountered it, is the cage they were building for a woman they had never met and needed, desperately, to contain. Propertius is blunter. In his elegy on Actium, he asks, in what reads partly as horrified outrage and partly as something more difficult to name, Femina. A woman. And she dared to bring war against our weapons? The line pulses with something, with disgust, yes, but also with something that might be fear, remembered fear, the fear of a Rome that had genuinely believed, in the years before Actium, that the East might win. I want to be honest with you about something. I have read Horace's Ode many times, and every time I feel two things at once. I feel genuine aesthetic pleasure. The Latin is clean and sharp and occasionally achingly lovely, even in translation. And I feel something else, something quieter and less comfortable, which is the knowledge of what the ode did, what it was for. The Fatale Monstrum did not need to be carved in stone. It only needed to be beautiful enough to remember, and it was. It crossed 2,000 years without difficulty, passed hand to hand through the centuries, like a coin worn smooth, but still bearing its image. In the candlelit study, the stylus moved, the wax received the words. And somewhere in the distance, across the Mediterranean, across the years, a woman who had administered a complex state in 9 languages, who had presented herself to her people as the incarnation of Isis, who had looked at the Roman world and understood it better than most Romans did, was being distilled, very carefully, into a single phrase. Fatal monster. Not a ruler, not a mind, not a sovereign, a monster. The papyrus is roughly the size of a large book page. It is slightly brittle at the edges in the way that old linen goes, not crumbling exactly, but carrying that particular resistance that says, I have been here a very long time, and I am holding on. The surface is fibrous, woven from the pith of a plant that grew along the Nile in extraordinary abundance, and it smells, even now, of something you cannot quite name, dry and faintly organic, the smell of old time itself, of linen and dust, and the particular still air of a room that has not changed in centuries. The ink on its surface is a faint warm brown, iron gall or carbon-based, applied with a reed pen by a hand that has been still for 2,000 years. Near the bottom of the document, a royal administrative decree granting tax exemptions to a Roman businessman named Publius Canidius, a man associated with Mark Antony. There is a single word. Ginestoi. Let it be done, or make it happen, or, more simply, granted. I want to stop here for a moment, because I genuinely cannot move past this without sitting with it for just a second. I think about this word more than I probably should. The papyrus is known formally as P. Bingen 45. It is held in Berlin, at the Ägyptisches Museum und Papyrussammlung, and it dates to the year 33 BCE, one of the final years of Cleopatra's reign, 3 years before everything ended. The document itself is bureaucratic in nature, the kind of administrative grant that moved through royal offices constantly, tax exemptions and trade privileges, and the formal apparatus of a working state. At the bottom of this particular document, in a hand that differs noticeably from the scribal hand that wrote the body of the text, someone wrote, Ginestoi. The question that scholars have debated carefully, and I want to be precise here, because the uncertainty matters, is whether that word is in Cleopatra's own hand. The Egyptologist and papyrologist Peter van Minnen, who published a detailed analysis of this document in 2000, argued that the handwriting of the subscription is different enough from the scribal hand to suggest it was written by a different person entirely, and that in the Ptolemaic administrative tradition, royal subscriptions, the final authorizing mark on a decree, were sometimes added by the monarch personally. Van Minnen argued the case carefully, and the argument has been taken seriously, though not universally accepted. Other scholars have noted that such subscriptions could equally have been written by a royal secretary acting on behalf of the Queen. The honest position, and I think the honest position is actually the more interesting one, is that we cannot be certain. The handwriting may be hers, it may not be. But here is what I find genuinely moving about that uncertainty. It does not diminish the word. It is still there. It was still written in Alexandria, in the 33rd year before the Common Era, in a palace built where the Mediterranean light came through in long pale sheets across white stone floors. Someone in that palace, and the evidence, however contested, points closer to Cleopatra herself than to anyone else, looked at a document granting privileges to one of her officer's associates and wrote a single Greek word that meant, "Yes, done. Let it be so." She was still running her country. She was still working. The erasure had not happened yet. Let me tell you something about papyrus survival, because I think you will find it genuinely surprising, and because it is one of the quiet miracles sitting underneath this entire section. Papyrus is organic material. It is, in the most basic sense, a plant. And organic material decays. It is consumed by moisture, by bacteria, by the slow, patient work of time on anything that was once living. The default state of a papyrus document is not surviving. The overwhelming majority of everything ever written on papyrus in the ancient world has simply ceased to exist. It rotted, or it burned, or it was flooded, or it was used as wrapping material, or fuel, or stuffing for mummified animals, and it is gone. What we have is, statistically speaking, almost nothing, a fraction of a fraction. But Egypt has a particular gift to give historians, and that gift is climate. The Nile Valley, especially Upper Egypt, away from the delta's humidity, is extraordinarily dry. Rainfall in places like Oxyrhynchus or Fayum is minimal to the point of near absence, and in that dryness, sealed beneath centuries of sand and rubble, documents that would have decayed anywhere else in the ancient world simply did not. They waited. Papyri from Roman-era Egypt, private letters, tax receipts, land surveys, court proceedings, shopping lists, love letters, medical prescriptions, school children's writing exercises, have survived in quantities that represent one of the most remarkable archives of daily life in the ancient world. The historian Roger Bagnall, one of the great scholars of papyrology, has written about this archive as transformative in its implications. It does not just tell us about the powerful, it tells us about ordinary people, their disputes and debts and family arrangements, the texture of everyday existence in a way that literary sources almost never can. What this means for Cleopatra specifically is important. The papyrological record of her reign, the administrative documents, the royal decrees, the bureaucratic machinery of the Ptolemaic state, gives us a view of her that Roman literary sources cannot and did not want to provide. It shows a queen managing grain prices and tax policy and trade privileges and land allocations. It shows, in the dry language of administrative documents, a ruler governing a complex, multi-layered state with the kind of practical attention that keeps things actually functioning. These are not the records of a seductress. They are the records of an administrator, a working monarch, a person who understood how power was maintained not through spectacle alone, but through the patient, unglamorous work of governance. Back in Alexandria, in the administrative quarters of the palace complex, the work never stops. The palace sits at the edge of the Brucheion, the royal quarter that juts into the harbour on a long spit of land, and the harbour smells of salt and pitch and the cedar wood that arrives in the merchant ships from Lebanon. The administrative offices are cooler than the outer rooms. Thick stone walls keep the Egyptian summer at something manageable, and the sound in them is the particular quiet sound of reed pens moving across papyrus surfaces, the occasional soft knock of a seal being pressed into wax, the low voices of officials consulting one another in a mixture of Greek and Egyptian. Cleopatra had made a point, a political point as much as a practical one, of being able to speak to her subjects in their own language, the first Ptolemaic ruler to have bothered. That choice echoes through everything. It is there in the administrative papyri that move through the offices in their hundreds, documents that carry the weight of governance in the most literal sense. They are the state, inscribed on plant fibre, moving through the machinery of a civilization. The documents from her reign that survive show land grants, tax arrangements, fiscal policies applied to specific regions and specific populations. The historian Duane Roller, whose 2010 biography of Cleopatra remains one of the most scrupulously sourced accounts available, has described the administrative papyri as evidence of a ruler who was genuinely engaged with the mechanisms of her kingdom. Not a figurehead, not a ceremonial presence, but an active executive. The biographer Stacy Schiff, in her 2010 work, Cleopatra, A Life, makes a similar observation, that the texture of daily Ptolemaic administration that emerges from the papyri is simply incompatible with the image Roman sources preserved. You do not manage grain allocations for a famine-stressed province while being primarily occupied with personal seduction. These are not activities that coexist in the way the Roman account suggests. And then there is the temple evidence, which Rome could not touch at all. At Dendera, on the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, the Temple of Hathor still stands, one of the best preserved temple complexes in the country. On the outer southern wall, carved in low relief in the ancient Egyptian manner, Cleopatra appears as pharaoh. She wears the double crown. She is shown making offerings to the gods, in the formal posture of a legitimate monarch, performing the rites that maintain cosmic order, the ancient Egyptian concept of Ma'at, the correct balance of the world. She is not presenting herself as a Greek queen. She is not presenting herself in the Hellenistic style that would have been familiar to the Ptolemaic court she grew up in. She is presenting herself as an Egyptian ruler in an unbroken line stretching back through 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition. Beside her, smaller in scale in the Egyptian convention that indicates lesser status, is her son Caesarion, Ptolemy XV, her child by Julius Caesar, also shown in pharaonic regalia. I find something in this relief that I keep returning to. Rome rewrote her in words. Egypt recorded her in stone, and stone, in the dry climate of Upper Egypt, lasts rather longer than reputation. The version of Cleopatra on that wall at Dendera is not the version that Octavian's poets preserved. She is not the Eastern seductress of Horace's. Not the exotic threat of Propertius, not the fatal woman of 2,000 years of Western imagination. She is a pharaoh. She is making the correct gestures to ensure that the world continues to hold together. She is doing her job in the idiom of a civilization that was. The morning that Octavian's triumph entered Rome, the city smelled of crushed laurel and torched resin, the kind of thick ceremonial smoke that clung to wool and skin for days afterward. It was August of the year 29 BCE. The war was over, Egypt was a province, and the man who would soon rename himself Augustus had arranged, with the particular care of someone who understood that spectacle is policy, exactly what Rome would be allowed to see. Let me be honest with you about something. What I find most remarkable about the aftermath of Cleopatra's death is not the death itself. It is what happened in the weeks and months that followed. Because what happened was not mourning, and it was not simply celebration. It was architecture. Octavian was building something, and he was building it carefully, and the material he was working with was not stone or marble. It was memory. 3 triumphs in total, celebrated over 3 consecutive days in late August of 29 BCE, one for Illyricum, one for Actium, one for Egypt. The third day was the one that mattered. The crowds along the processional route had been standing since before the sun crested the Capitoline Hill, their feet aching on the stone, the smell of the crowd a warm press of bodies and street food and animal sweat, because triumphal processions included livestock, included spoils, included the visual theatre of everything that had been taken. Wagons rolled through carrying the Ptolemaic treasury, gold vessels, carved furniture, the accumulated wealth of 3 centuries of a dynasty that had been, until recently, one of the richest royal houses in the world. The historian Cassius Dio records that so much Egyptian treasure was displayed during this period that interest rates in Rome dropped sharply as gold flooded the market. That detail has always struck me as quietly extraordinary. The fall of a civilization, legible in a drop in the lending rate. But Cleopatra herself was not there. She had made sure of that. She had died, in her own palace, by her own decision, 11 days after Antony, and historians have long agreed that one of her primary motivations, possibly the primary motivation, was to deny Octavian exactly the spectacle he wanted. Plutarch, drawing on earlier sources, suggests she was told what would happen to her in Rome, and what she imagined was, by ancient standards, an accurate imagining. She would have been walked in chains through the city. Her children might have walked with her. The Roman crowd would have watched. So what Octavian had, instead, was an effigy. He had an image of her, a representation, a figure, carried in the triumphal procession in her place. Ancient sources describe this, and the detail that has fastened itself into scholarly memory is what the effigy was depicted doing. It was shown reclining, with a serpent, the asp. Even in death, even replaced by a simulacrum, Octavian could not resist shaping the image. He required her to be showing Romans what they had already decided she was, exotic, dangerous, and destroyed by her own nature. I find this genuinely moving in the worst possible way. The woman had denied him a body, and he had simply made one. He arranged her death for her, in effigy, and walked it through the streets of Rome, and the crowd, who had never seen her, who knew her almost entirely through the propaganda of the preceding decade, watched a symbol of everything they had been told to fear, and the fear was now safely over. Let me tell you about the Roman triumph as an institution, because I think it will change how you hear everything I am about to say. A Roman triumph was not simply a victory parade. It was a carefully codified ritual with extremely specific rules. The general had to enter Rome in a chariot, wearing a toga picta dyed in Tyrian purple, his face painted red to mimic the cult statue of Jupiter. Spoils were displayed, soldiers marched, and defeated enemies were displayed, either in person, walking in chains at the back of the procession, or through images and representations when the person themselves was unavailable. What is important to understand is that the triumph fixed the narrative. Once a triumph was celebrated, the version of events it embodied became, in a very real sense, official. It was the state's declaration of what the war had meant and who the enemy had been. Defeated rulers walked in Roman triumphs regularly, and what happened to them afterward varied. Some were executed, others were imprisoned. Julius Caesar himself, in his triumph of 46 BCE, had walked Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, in chains through Rome. And here is the detail that complicates everything. The Roman crowd wept. Plutarch and others note that the sight of a young princess in chains, whatever they thought of Egypt, provoked genuine public distress. Caesar ultimately released Arsinoe rather than execute her, which was unusual, and scholars have argued that public sympathy played a role. It is a complicated moment, because it suggests that the Roman feeling about Egypt and Egyptians was never as simple as Roman propaganda required it to be. People could hate the abstract queen and still weep for the specific princess. Octavian knew this. He had watched what happened when Caesar displayed Arsinoe. He was not going to display Cleopatra. Back with our subject, or rather, with what remained of her. The systematic work that followed was thorough. In Rome itself, statues and images of Cleopatra were suppressed or removed. Public monuments associating Antony and Cleopatra in any celebratory way were erased or repurposed. The legal apparatus of damnatio memoriae, the formal Roman practice of erasing a person from public record, was not technically applied to Cleopatra because she was a foreign queen. rather than a Roman citizen, but the practical effect was similar. The names, the images, the commemorations, gone or going. The killing of Caesarion came quickly. Ptolemy XV Caesar, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, 17 years old, who had been sent south for safety before Alexandria fell, was captured and killed on Octavian's orders. The ancient source Plutarch records that Octavian's advisor Arius used a dark phrase in recommending the execution, that too many Caesars was not a good thing. Whether the phrase is historical or literary, the logic was real. Caesarion's existence was itself a kind of claim on Caesar's legacy, on Egypt, on the legitimacy of everything Cleopatra had tried to build. He could not be allowed to live. With him gone, the line ended. The argument ended. The Ptolemaic treasury was stripped and transported to Rome. The library, or what remained of it, was not formally destroyed in this period. The great destruction of the Alexandrian library is one of those historical events that happened not in a single catastrophe, but through a long accumulation of damage across centuries. But the intellectual and cultural institutions of the city began their decline. Egypt became a province, and a peculiar one. Octavian treated it as essentially personal property, barring Roman senators from even visiting without his permission. The wealth of Egypt, which had sustained Ptolemaic power for 3 centuries, now flowed directly to Rome. And yet he left one statue standing. In the temple of Venus Genetrix in Rome, the temple Julius Caesar had dedicated to the divine ancestor of the Julian family, there was a golden statue of Cleopatra that Caesar himself had placed there. Cassius Dio tells us it was still standing in his own time, which is to say it survived at least into the early 3rd century CE. Octavian did not remove it. He could not remove it without implicating Caesar, without removing something Caesar had deliberately installed in a temple to Caesar's own divine family. To erase the statue would have been to admit that Caesar had been wrong, or foolish, or compromised, and Octavian's entire political identity was built on being Caesar's legitimate heir and avenger. The statue stayed. I think about this more than I probably should. The man who controlled the narrative, who arranged the effigy, who killed her son, who stripped her treasury, who walked her image in chains through a city that had never seen her face, could not remove a single golden statue from a temple in the heart of Rome, because removing her would have required removing some part of the man whose name he wore. Cleopatra remained in the temple of Venus Genetrix. She remained in stone, or in gold, in a temple dedicated to the ancestral goddess of the very family that had defeated her. There is something quietly satisfying in that. It is not justice, but it is something. Somewhere in that temple, in the particular quality of Roman morning light, filtering through an entrance to fall on gilded stone, her face was still present. The incense burned, the worshippers came and went, and the queen who had been walked in effigy through the streets, rendered as seduction and serpent and danger, stood in the same room where Romans prayed to the mother of their ruling family. Her expression, whatever Caesar had asked the sculptor to give her, unchanged by everything that had been decided about her elsewhere. She outlasted the man who arranged her erasure. She outlasted the empire that swallowed her kingdom. She is, in a particular and genuine sense, still here. The wind moves differently across stone that has stood for 2,000 years. There is a particular quality to it, not quite sound, not quite silence, something in between, the way air navigates around carved surfaces, finding the grooves of hieroglyphs, the raised relief of a goddess's outstretched hand, the curve of a face that was placed there deliberately, for permanence, by people who understood that stone outlasts almost everything else. At the Temple of Dendera, in Upper Egypt, on the outer southern wall, there is a relief carved in the 1st century BCE. It shows Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, the one Rome tried so hard to reduce, standing as pharaoh, in the traditional regalia, presenting offerings to the goddess Hathor. She is not depicted as a seductress. She is not depicted as a foreign temptress in Roman eyes. She is depicted the way pharaohs had been depicted for 3,000 years, as divine authority incarnate, as the earthly vessel of cosmic order, as someone who belonged entirely and unquestionably to this place and this tradition. Rome never wanted you to see that image. The erasure was enormous. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves to be said plainly before we talk about what survived. The campaign that Octavian ran against Cleopatra, the poems he commissioned, the histories he shaped, the monuments he controlled, was not a casual exercise in political spin. It was sustained, systematic, and extraordinarily effective. It ran for centuries. It moved through languages and cultures and art forms. It crossed the Mediterranean and then the Channel and then the Atlantic. It arrived in Hollywood. And for most of the 2,000 years since her death, when someone in the Western world pictured Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last ruler of an independent Egypt, what they pictured was a Roman invention. Let me tell you how that happened, and then let me tell you why it failed. The first vehicle was the literary record. Octavian's poets, and they were, in a real sense, his, did their work well. Horace called her a fatale monstrum, a deadly monster, in his ode celebrating the Battle of Actium. The phrase landed and it stayed. Propertius wrote of her as a woman who sold Rome's honour for her bed. Virgil, in the Aeneid, placed her at Actium, surrounded by the noise of her foreign instruments. Her face, the face of approaching chaos. These were not neutral literary judgments. They were political acts, dressed in the language of art. Octavian had won a war, and these poems were part of the process of explaining why the war had been necessary. And that explanation required Cleopatra to be not a strategic opponent, but a moral corruption, a seduction, an Eastern contamination, something Rome had purged itself of, with difficulty and courage, and was now free from. That framing required her actual qualities to be invisible. Her languages, gone. Her administrative capability, gone. Her theological authority within Egyptian tradition, reframed as superstition, as Oriental excess. The coins she issued, small, heavy, bearing her face and her titles, scattered across the Mediterranean to be melted down, forgotten, lost in soil and riverbed and ruin. The papyri she signed, many of them lost, the surviving ones largely unknown for centuries. The temple walls, still there, still showing her in pharaonic regalia, but nobody in Rome or Athens or Constantinople was reading them. The knowledge required to read them had itself been lost. And then Plutarch wrote his Life of Antony. Roughly 130 years after her death, Plutarch is a complicated figure in this story. He is in many ways genuinely careful. He preserves the detail about her languages, he describes her intelligence directly, he allows her something approaching full humanity. But he is also writing within a tradition that Rome had already shaped. The seduction narrative was already calcified. He deploys it even as he complicates it, and his account became, in the centuries that followed, the source, the channel through which Cleopatra passed into Western consciousness, through Plutarch into the Renaissance, through the Renaissance into something even more durable. Let me step back for a moment and tell you something about what happened next, because I think you'll find it genuinely fascinating, and because it explains why the erasure lasted as long as it did. In 1606 or thereabouts, William Shakespeare wrote, Antony and Cleopatra. And here is the paradox at the heart of the Western tradition. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is, in certain significant ways, closer to the historical figure than almost anything that came after. She is politically intelligent. She is manipulative in ways that read as strategic rather than merely sexual. She is genuinely funny. She mourns with the weight of someone who has lost something real and irreplaceable. She makes calculations. She understands power. The scholar and classicist Mary Beard has noted that Shakespeare, working primarily from Thomas North's 1579 English translation of Plutarch's Greek, produced something more complicated than the Roman propaganda, a character who bears, at minimum, traces of the woman who actually existed. But here is the cruel irony. The play is magnificent. It is also, because it is Shakespeare, because it entered the English-speaking world as the pinnacle of literary achievement, the thing that calcified the image for the next 4 centuries. What travelled forward through the culture was not Plutarch's careful ambivalence. What travelled forward was the queen of infinite variety. The woman defined by her relationship to 2 Roman men, the tragedy of a love story set against collapsing empire. The politics softened, the sovereignty disappeared. What remained was the electricity of the story, the passion, the spectacle, the asp and the marble, and all of that was adapted, reinterpreted, and amplified by painters, playwrights, novelists, and eventually film directors, who each contributed their own layer of distortion to a figure who was, underneath all of it, becoming less and less visible. By the time Hollywood got hold of her, Sarah Bernhardt in 1899, Theda Bara in 1917, Claudette Colbert in 1934, and then Elizabeth Taylor in 1963, the most expensive film ever made at that point, the erasure was effectively complete. What was being depicted was not a pharaoh, not a linguist, not a naval strategist who nearly built a Red Sea fleet to escape Roman capture and start again in another ocean entirely. What was being depicted was the most spectacular version of what Rome had always wanted her to be: beauty, desire, excess, and ruin, dressed in gold, arriving on a barge, dying for love. The version Rome tried to erase was nowhere in frame. And then something began to shift. The scholarly recovery of Cleopatra, the slow, careful, unglamorous work of reassembly from coins and papyri and temple reliefs and the spaces between Roman sentences, is, I find, one of the genuinely moving intellectual projects of the last several decades. Because what it required was not just academic rigor, it required a willingness to look at the sources and ask, who wrote this, and why, and what were they trying to make you believe? Duane Roller's 2010 biography. Cleopatra, a biography. Approach the ancient sources with exactly that kind of critical attention, reading the Roman literary record not as testimony but as propaganda, and then asking what other evidence existed and what it suggested. Joyce Tyldesley, in her careful scholarly work on the Ptolemaic queens, helped restore the Egyptian context that Roman accounts had deliberately stripped away. Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra, A Life. Published in 2010 and reaching a wide general readership, did something important. It communicated, in vivid and accessible prose, just how little of what most people believed about Cleopatra was supported by disinterested evidence, and just how extraordinary the figure who emerged from a more careful reading actually was. Adrian Goldsworthy brought a military historian's eye to the strategic dimension, the geopolitical reality of what Cleopatra was attempting, the genuine threat she posed, the rational calculation that underpinned decisions that Roman sources had explained away as passion, and the non-literary evidence kept accumulating. Numismatists studying Ptolemaic coinage, scholars like Guy Weil Grayson, whose work on the coins has done much to challenge the received image, noted that Cleopatra's coins show a face of striking authority, not the idealized beauty of Roman convention, a face of power, a face that was not asking for approval. Egyptologists working on the temple inscriptions at Dendera and Edfu and Philae described a figure in complete command of the theological and ritual vocabulary of her tradition, a pharaoh who had done the work, who had earned the regalia, who was not performing Egyptian identity, but inhabiting it. The erasure required enormous effort because the truth had a weight of its own. It kept surfacing, in the stone, in the metal, in the careful administrative hand on a papyrus that bore her name. She did not need Rome's permission to be formidable. She simply was. I want to leave you with an image before we move into the last quiet part of this story together. Late afternoon light in the Egyptian desert has a quality that is difficult to describe to someone who has not seen it. It arrives at an angle, It is golden and dense, and it falls on stone surfaces with something approaching tenderness, finding every carved groove, filling every hieroglyph with shadow, so that words and images that have been invisible in the midday glare suddenly become legible, suddenly come forward, suddenly insist on being seen. The temple at Dendera was not built to be hidden. It was built, the last pharaoh, softly now. Host voice. I want to stay here with you for a little while longer, just a little while. No new information, no more names or dates or campaigns, just this, the quietness of what we have been sitting with together, allowed to settle now, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, without hurry, finding its place at the bottom of things. I find myself coming back, always, to the same image. Not the palace, not the ships burning at Actium, or the marble halls of Alexandria, or even the great library with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls. I come back to something smaller. I come back to the coins. You may remember, and it does not matter if you do not, let it rest wherever it rested, but somewhere in this story I mentioned the coins that Cleopatra minted in her own name, bearing her own face. Not the soft, seductive face that Rome later painted her with. Not the fantasy, the real one. Strong jaw, prominent nose, the diadem of a sovereign. A face that said, I am here. I am a ruler. Look at me plainly. And on some of those coins, the image of Caesarion beside her. Her son with Caesar. Two sovereigns, mother and child, Egypt and the future, pressed into bronze and gold and sent out into the world. Those coins circulated. People held them. Traders in Alexandria, farmers in the Delta, merchants along the Nile routes, sailors moving between ports. Ordinary people with rough hands and sun-darkened skin held a small piece of bronze with her face on it and exchanged it for bread or oil or passage across a river. I find that genuinely moving. I think about it more than I probably should, that after all the epic machinery of history, the wars and the alliances and the propaganda and the poetry that outlasted them all, it is possible that the truest record of who she was, the most honest document, is a small coin worn smooth by hands that history never recorded. People who held her face and never thought to write down what they thought of it. Just, this is the queen, this is currency, this is real. Perhaps that is the thing worth sitting with, as you let the story soften around the edges. The idea that truth, genuine truth, has a way of surviving in the smallest things. In metal pressed with a face. In a building dedicated to a goddess. In the fact that for 3 centuries after her death, ordinary Egyptians kept her memory in a form that Rome could not entirely reach. The version Rome tried to erase was not only a political argument, it was a person. A specific, irreducible, impossible to fully know person who woke up in the mornings and moved through rooms we can only try to imagine, who spoke in 8 languages and thought in ways we cannot entirely reconstruct, who loved, perhaps, we think she loved, the records suggest she may have, in ways that were also political and also private and also her own, and who faced the end of everything she had built with what her enemies later called defiance, and what I find myself wanting to call simply dignity. You do not need to hold on to any of the details now. Let them go. Let the names ease away. Octavian, Antony, Caesar, Ptolemy, all of them growing quieter now, growing dim, like torches at the end of a long corridor, burning smaller and smaller as you walk away from them. Let the story soften. Let it become just this, a woman at the edge of the ancient world who was more than anyone later wanted to admit, and who knew it, and who built her life accordingly, and who has been waiting, very patiently, for someone to look at the coins and the temples and the documents that survived, and say, yes, there she is, that is closer to the truth. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever room, in whatever city, in whatever particular quiet you have found, I hope you carry something of that patience with you into sleep. The patience of a life that was buried and recovered. The patience of a story that waited 2,000 years to be heard more clearly. Let your breathing slow now. Let your shoulders drop. Let the jaw unclench, the hands open, the legs go heavy. There is nothing required of you right now. No understanding, no remembering, no holding on. Just the darkness behind your eyes, which is a very old darkness. The same darkness that has always been there, steady, unhurried, not going anywhere. The candle gutters. The river moves. The stars over Alexandria are the same stars, more or less, that are over you right now, though she called them by different names. Sleep well, friend. You have been somewhere real tonight, and now you are home, and it is quiet, and you can rest. Good night, wherever you are.